Behalf of Knowledge Maps. This is my end of quarter spring 2018 video reflection on how the quarter went and what I managed to learn. So last quarter on Knowledge Maps, this is my current project page, a couple links are broken, I'll update it soon. I was investigating the different approaches of JavaScript and how much it would help learners if we gave them an approach tree. So for example, an approach tree of the different methods of constructing carousels and sliders. It's a little bit blurry here, but you can see that it focuses on characteristics and then gives potential approaches. And I was trying to have them get the approach tree, construct it, and have them classify new examples onto a new knowledge map. So this quarter is different because I had a context switch, no reference intended to operating systems, but I swapped from JavaScript to CSS, primarily because the language, the component of CSS in web development is more concrete, so it's easier to focus, and since it has such a visual base in it, it's easier to identify approaches and to classify approaches and their drawbacks. So that led me to my problem motivation for this quarter and my central question, which is how do we get advanced beginner CSS developers from X330 or equivalent basic CSS experience to comfortably, or more often than not uncomfortably during my studies, analyze professional examples as well as tutorial examples and be able to reason their way through the approaches and thoroughly understand each approach's characteristics, traits, and trade-offs. So essentially, how can we have professional example analysis, which is very similar to the old knowledge map idea, and have the learners be able to apply these approaches to their future work? So this broke down into 3 research questions that I seek to focus on. The first one being, how can we tackle the existing problem of users going through a whole list of the examples sequentially without comparison? This tended to be a tendency that carried on from last quarter, and being the same, having the same purpose resulted in this question being explored further because I expected it to happen again. The second one is, how do we provide help, and what type / in what conditions will we provide help to the users? So how can we better scaffold them? And the third one is, how do we assess the depth of a user's knowledge using measurements following our study? And what exactly is the depth of a user's knowledge and capabilities? So in other words, in simpler terms, how much does a user really understand by taking part in our process? So I'll go through 2 notable studies that I conducted over the quarter, as well as the underlying details and why I learned. So the first one was my status update, which took place during week 5, and here's the document. And we paired off people into different pairs. One person was the observer, who had a separate document observing the partner. Their partner, being the study participant, was given 7 different examples, asked to fill out a knowledge map, and then 2 follow-up questions in 30 minutes total. So the idea was to examine each one of these examples. I'll open up one of the CodaPens right here to examine it, write a little bit of a blurb here on how spacing works, and then eventually organize their knowledge map and answer a couple of follow-up questions with regards to CSS Flex and Grid, which are the 2 approaches that I analyzed this quarter, which took off from JavaScript, carousels, and sliders. So after analyzing and getting reflection and feedback and reading over observer logs, what I realized that worked is the interactive nature of CodePen examples. So here, let me modify it, prove that properties were very concrete. So for example, the one property I wanted them to explore here was the grid row gap property, which changes the gap between the rows in this particular grid. And the recompile cycle of CodePen and auto-compiling made it very fast and to get feedback from the code, so it made it very easy to sense make. The second one is that the examples were all very specific. So in here we have a very basic setup in HTML. There's nothing fancy. It's just a grid container. And then I'm just testing everyone's ability to sense make a particular property. So that made it very easy to identify the differences. So those were the 2 main successes. I think what really did not work was the time constraint. So going through this in 30 minutes was very rushed. In fact, the resulting study document showed me that most people were able to identify the examples as Flex or Grid, so they were able to fill out the knowledge map, but they really weren't able to further dig deeper into their understanding because it was such a constrained time. But nevertheless, I think the biggest thing that I learned during this one particular study is that users do not know what to do when they're stuck. So let me take an example here. So let's say I took example 1, but I missed the grid row gap and the grid column gap in, and I somehow went to go change, this is a relatively simple example where emphasis is on grid column gap, but let's say I proceeded to change padding. And let's say I didn't really know what padding was. Whoa, the boxes are really big. As a result, what I'm trying to illustrate is that the users who did not pick up on the distinct differences did not know what to do when they were stuck. Neither did they know what to do when they were given a property that they really weren't familiar with or couldn't immediately sense make. And this turned into a snowball effect because after they didn't know for a particular example, I forbade them from looking up documentation because that would give them answers, so they couldn't fill out the knowledge map correctly. So with the learnings or with the setbacks that I encountered during this study, as well as the fact that I realized I didn't really have a good metric to measure how much users knew, so that was one of my research questions that I ended up really focusing very heavily on. I thought about how I can further change my study, and my study went through many weeks of iterations and refinements during SIG. But I think one notable thing that I really learned a lot of this quarter was the new learnings. So let me take a photo here. So in my cubby, my spaceship, I read one paper in particular. Let me zoom back out here so you can get a better view of it. Called from a journal. It was chapter 7, and it was called "The Power of Comparison in Learning and Instruction: Learning Outcomes Supported by Different Types of Comparisons." And I think this table does a really good summary of my learnings from research and related work. So particularly, it helped me assign names and labels to the methods I was actually trying to test and using to test in my studies. So particularly what I learned was that the correct method comparison was something that I needed to focus more on. Up to now, I didn't really ask them which is better or when can you use one over the other. So knowing multiple methods and using the most appropriate method, that's kind of the end goal. So that was something I realized I needed to put more of inside. I think another one that I realized was problem categories. So how do the problems differ? I realized that one is something that I was testing up to then, with the flex and grid comparison. And what was also interesting was the knowledge map. So the knowledge map, the whole end goal of the knowledge map was to use conceptual comparison. So what concepts do they share? In this case, they would share flex and grid. So, and ultimately, we wanted the users to be able to pick up the goal of problem comparison and the methodology, which allows them to solve problems using the new target method. So kind of by analyzing and reading through this paper and the corresponding studies, I was able to learn what methods each one of the steps in my particular study cover, as well as what methods I should use next and which methods I could explore more of and test further. So this led me throughout the quarter to a revised study, which got better and better over time, not just in how it measured, but just how well it embodied the existing research. So it led me to actually my final iteration of my study rubric. This was revised June 4th, before Sprint 5, or after Sprint 5 too, but primarily before Sprint 5, where I now compiled 10 examples. And what I did that was very different is I tried to encourage reflection, so kind of a brief verbal explanation as opposed to written explanation after every example, examined before the knowledge map. And then a key thing that I wanted to bring up was that I scaffolded and included help if needed, but under the criteria that it required an explanation. So specifically what I was focusing on is I wanted to note down the example, and I wanted the user to give me as accurate of or as clear of as they could a verbal explanation of what they know and one sentence explanation of what they don't know. And the idea here was I wanted to test the idea of specific feedback catered to a specific blocker, so that way I wouldn't give away the answer, and I would also be able to essentially hit the nail straight on the head with what they were stuck with. And the scaffolds that I provided primarily were from csstricks.com. So if we actually take, for example, this example right here, this is example 3 from the study, where we're tackling the grid area property, but the they're able to change it, for example. So let's say this is 2 and 3, and they notice the difference here, but they aren't able to verbalize, how it's like working. They might think this is like a fraction, which actually happened a lot. It's not a fraction, thanks to CSS. But regardless, I gave them this small segment of code, or this small segment of explanation, and that was enough to resolve that blocker so that they can at least get the understanding, so we could test their deeper level understanding. So what was also different was that I included a comparison method question. So first of all, I wanted them to have a conceptual comparison where they were able to dictate the differences between CSS Flex and Grid based on examples with regards to sizing, borders, and alignment. That was like a simpler, higher level question. The deeper level question, which was the correct method comparison question, was testing edge cases, which is with the ones that can be written with Flex or Grid, either way, which one is better, and the justification. So I was looking for how many of these justifications they could get, as well as how many of the differences they could capture, and how much evidence they could use to support from the 10 examples. So I think what worked very well actually was the scaffolding that I mentioned. So the big problem was counteracted with a very effective solution. Because I was able to understand directly that a lot of the help that they asked for is actually syntax related. Sorry, but now they are able to clearly get help, and we have a clear procedure. Unfortunately, what did not work is that the scaffolding works well for very specific examples. So if let's take this very simple example. If I took this example, but I didn't understand something else, or I just didn't understand how these boxes were arranged, or I was completely off track, I wouldn't be able to effectively scaffold the user by just providing documentation or an explanation without directly giving away the answer. So that's one of the constraints of fixed examples and one of the constraints of my scaffolding that I need to think more of. The reflection was very good. It was good in that finally users were able to verbalize themselves, and they usually explain everything correctly to me. I think the main drawback of it was, let's say we took example 3, they will compare it to the previous examples that were in the column that the example belonged to, but not so much in the other column. So all of the examples of Grid will be compared to Grid, while all of the examples of Flex will be compared to Flex. And that was something that was a pretty big drawback, because I wanted a comparison between Grid as well as Flex. So further scaffolding would have to be necessary. Edge cases proved tricky sometimes because I didn't have a scaffolding mechanism for wrongful thinking necessarily. At this level, if sometimes individuals will identify the wrong preferred approach. So in this case, let's take example 3. You could use a flex basis value of grid width, a flex grow value, and a flex shrink value, as opposed to the grid layout where you would size it relative to the axes. But sometimes it came down to personal bias within experts who have used grid extensively and feel like flex is very new, so grid's very comfortable. So I need to focus more on how I can use edge cases that further suggest which one is better than the other. So I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes my questions or the differences can be answered through reasons other than one is better than another. I also spent a good amount of the quarter working on the interface model, so I'm going to pull it up here. So I created 3 different views here, embodying 3 different features, holding back to 3 different design arguments. The first one is the CodePen, the built-in CodePen or lifetime editor that I want to include. And that ties back to the fact that before you can actually classify examples, you need to fully understand them. And CodePen is arguably the fastest way to get feedback from your changes. Here we have 2 different examples here that I pulled up with their code, as well as the compiled output, so that the CodePen editor and this resulting feature seem to embody the characteristics of that particular design argument. The second one is that focuses on edge cases, but specifically focuses on the new type of, I guess, extended edge case with professional examples. So I'm trying to build a interface where I can immediately launch Ply or add a new example on my own, and then have the preview of the compiled output. So by being able to have variety in your examples between professional and simple is something that I look forward to working on and working on more, and something that would test my design arguments further. And the third one is The knowledge map view, I wanted the knowledge map to constantly be accessible. Here we have kind of like a bunch of tiles at the bottom, and you can readily click on code. Click on, for example, these little blocks to look at the corresponding code, kind of in workspace view. But anytime you can go back to the knowledge map, because I think what's really important is that this constant view of the knowledge map so that the learner can be making consistent comparisons as opposed to the reflections from my previous study. So I think I wanted to go over a couple of limitations now. So the first limitation falls imply, but it's not really a limitation to some degree. What I realized is that, so if we, here I'm on Pinterest, my Pinterest account. So if we took this red dot here for 10 seconds, this little post here, and I wanted to figure out if it was flex or grid and how it's done, Ply would take all of the corresponding CSS for this child element, but flex and grid is interesting because the parent container actually has to be labeled as well, and Ply doesn't take that. Although this could be a blessing in disguise, however, because the parent container and the property it's set to normally gives away whether it's flex or grid and invites lazy thinking on behalf of the study participant. So that could be something that is actually beneficial to me. Another one is the number of examples in my study. It's been something that I've really wanted to work further on. So this study in total was constrained to 1 hour. I think the big problem right now is that's preventing me from increasing the number of examples is I can find as many examples as I want, but the study time is going to increase. But nevertheless, I want to construct a larger example knowledge base, particularly with professional examples. So that leads me into my next steps, which is I want to source the professional examples. Whether the parent container is contained or not is a smaller matter and something that I can talk to Slim about. I want to test with professional examples because I feel like my design arguments are going to be tested further if I have professional examples. And I want to work more on the interface model. I feel like I'm at the last quarter where I can actually evade technology as much as I want to or don't want to, and work on this corresponding system model because up to now what I've been doing is curating these examples by hand, and it's proved to be rather inefficient in the long run and unscalable. So there's something for me to consider. Overall, I think this is a great quarter. I got a lot of interesting findings. I definitely learned a lot more on the process. It was a very focused quarter on research findings and background research. But it was nice working on the interface model, and I look forward to another quarter, starting winter quarter, since I won't be here in the fall. But yeah, it was great working, and this concludes my project recap. Thanks.